Right, I've got 20 minutes, and I'm going to try in that 20 minutes to lift your level of economic knowledge up to a point where you're all considerably more knowledgeable than the average Nobel Prize-winning economist. It's not a very high hurdle. I'm going to talk about why I think economics is in a state of crisis and about how we can get out of that crisis. And the answer is very much Darwinian, I think. But before I do that, I'm going to do something a little unusual for a talk on economics. I'm going to do a little experiment, and I'm going to use money, because economists never use money. Most economic theory doesn't have money in it at all. So I'm going to take out of my wallet £50, and I'm going to ask, could you hand it to that lady with the cap over there? Thank you. Now, according to mainstream economic theory, I've just made the audience feel happier collectively. I've increased the wealth of the audience, so everybody, not everybody, but the average level has gone up. I'm going to argue, actually, what I've done is I've made the average happiness level of the audience go down, because I've made just one person a little richer. And that's made one person happy, but it's just slightly miffed everybody else. Okay. So let's... Are you having sex with her after that? It was only £50. It was only £50. Right. So I'm going to start by explaining... I hope my wife's not watching this. I'm going to start by explaining why I think economics is in a crisis. Now, one of the symptoms of a science being in crisis is when it divides into multiple incompatible schools of thought, which are all fighting with each other. Now, we all know about the idea of left-wing economics, the Thomas Piketty, the Karl Marx sort of economics, and the right-wing economics, Chicago School, free market, laissez-faire economics. But what that left and right-wing spectrum doesn't do is really capture the full richness of the chaos within economic theory. So what I've done is I've plotted the different schools, instead of on a line, on a chart. And what I've got on the bottom of the chart is markets. How much does the school of thought believe that the market system is fundamentally a stabilizing system or fundamentally a destabilizing system? And then on the vertical axis, I've got the school of thought's attitude to government. Does the school want more government, like the Marxist school, who wants all government, or does it want no government, like the libertarian school? And with that, we can start to see a little bit more detail in the confusion within economics. So this is the dominant school of economics. This is the classical or the neoclassical school, which has been dominant for the last 30 years. Now, underpinning the theories behind the neoclassical school is a set of assumptions on the way things work in the economy. The first of those assumptions is that we are all trying to get basically as rich as possible. Every decision we make is designed to improve our utility in absolute terms. We just want to be as rich as we can get. The other thing, which I think plays very much to the field of our hosts here, is that they claim that every decision we make is entirely independent of the decisions that everybody else makes. So you can't have any fashions in this industry, you can't have any fads, you can't have any trends. Everything we do is entirely independent. Now, I think both of those assumptions you can challenge immediately. But they then take that and go a step further and say that because we're all perfect individuals, we're all making individual decisions, that means the economy is automatically a self-optimizing and self-stabilizing system. So this school of thought, there's no financial crashes, there's no booms, there's no busts. And believe it or not, that's the dominant school of thought. Hard to believe, isn't it? Now, there's another school of thought called the Austrian economics. Now, these guys they're sometimes confused with the classical school because they share a core belief that you don't want government involved. You want to leave the free markets alone to do their thing. But they differ in an important way from the classical school in that they say, actually, you do get credit cycles in the economy. You get booms and you get busts. So they say the markets are unstable, but nonetheless, the government should leave them alone to go through those booms and busts. And then there's this sort of libertarian school. These guys actually just don't really care about the economic theory. They just want as little government as they can get. So they're a sort of joint campaign group for the Austrians and the neoclassical school. Then we've got another couple of important schools, the Keynesian and the monetarist schools. Now, the Keynesian and monetarist schools, they basically exist because they're an admission that this school is wrong. So this school, although it produces the dominant theory of economics, what happens in the real economy, of course, is we go through booms and busts, and we try to manage those booms and busts. And we manage them in basically two ways, the Keynesian way or the monetarist way. The monetarist way, which has been popular for the last 30 years or so, is whenever we get an economic recession, the central bank or the government comes in and tries to encourage us all to borrow more money in order to get us out of that recession. So it's basically a process of encouraging the private sector to borrow money to boost the economic activity. The Keynesian school is basically doing the same thing, but instead of encouraging the private sector to do the borrowing and spending, it asks the government sector to do the borrowing and spending. But nonetheless, both of these schools are basically sort of admitting that these guys are right, but they want to stabilize the economy so that the theories of this group appear to work. So you've got this sort of mad confusion going on. Then we've got another school. This comes from a guy called Hyman Minsky. You may have heard around 2008 when Lehman Brothers was failing and the financial markets were going into meltdown, people started talking about a Minsky moment. And this is where the economy goes from a self-reinforcing credit expansion into a self-reinforcing credit contraction. And Minsky had a nice catchphrase. He said, stability creates instability. So the more these guys operate their policies to stabilize the economy, the more we borrow money. The more we borrow money, the less stable the economy becomes. So ultimately, the success of these guys creates the crisis, according to Hyman Minsky. The best way to think about that is imagine you've got a situation where you've got an area of forest and it's prone to forest fires. So you start a forest firefighting team, and they're very successful. And over 20 or 30 years, the dead wood in the forest builds up until eventually there is a fire that they can't control. So they sort of, by controlling the forest fire, and real foresters have worked this out, real economists haven't worked it out. By controlling the economic cycle too much, you get too much debt, and you eventually get a massive crisis. So then, of course, we've got another school, the Marxist school, which is now actually coming back into fashion a little bit, albeit a rather confused version of Marxism. The Marxists say, look, this is all nonsense. The markets are fundamentally a wealth polarizing mechanism. It causes wealth to flow up to the top of society and concentrate in the hands of very few people, and then the economy rolls over. So basically all we can do is just abandon capitalism altogether and go for a 100% government system. There's still a few more schools which I couldn't fit on the chart. There's then the institutional school of economics, which says, look, all of you guys are really trying to pretend that there are sort of fundamental laws of economics that exist sort of in a way that the fundamental laws of physics exist. And that's nonsense, because the laws of economics are really defined by the institutions of the economy, the laws and things like that. And then there's another one, the behavioral school of economics, which says, look, guys, you've got to actually think about how humans behave, which again is something that certainly the neoclassical school doesn't allow you to think about. Now, before I go into the next chart, I just want to point out one key thing that's different about this school of thought and about all of the others, and that is individuality. The dominant school of economic thinking requires that humans behave as perfect individuals. All of the other schools of thought are effectively a recognition that there are mechanisms within the economy which cause us to herd. So a credit boom. If somebody borrows money and spends it, that strengthens the economy. That creates jobs. That gives somebody else confidence to borrow money and spend it. So they borrow money, and that again causes somebody else to borrow money. The system works in the opposite direction. Paradox of thrift, as Keynes said. If you start to save, somebody else's income will go down. They will start to save, and you go into a self-reinforcing crisis. So there are very clear mechanisms that cause herding behavior, not to mention the advertising industry that tries to persuade us to buy all the same things at the same time, often quite successfully. So we clearly herd, but it's not allowed in the mainstream theory. Now, I want to come on to how do we sort this mess out. The philosopher Thomas Kuhn studied scientific crises, and he described, I think in great detail, exactly the situation that economics is in at the moment. We've got all these schools that are confused. And he said, what will happen in that situation is people will become tribal. They'll decide they believe in one or other of these schools, and they'll ignore the arguments of the other schools. And we're seeing this with the debate about Piketty's book at the moment. The right wing really don't give a damn about the data. They just know he's wrong. The left wing, they don't care that the FT has criticized some of his data. They just know he's right. And the two groups are at an impasse. Kuhn said, the way you get through this sort of scientific crisis is you need to find a new way to look at the problem, which can accept the valid arguments from all of those different schools. So you need to find a theory that can reconcile the ideas of the competing schools. So all we need to do is find a theory that can agree with Adam Smith and agree with Karl Marx. Believe it or not, it's possible. Thomas Kuhn then said another thing. He said the way science works is actually not the way we're all taught the way science works. Probably the way you think science works is there's a set of theories, and scientists are beavering away, checking the data, testing whether the theories are right, evolving the theories a little bit so that they fit the data, and progressing in that way. Kuhn said, actually, it doesn't work like that. What happens is we believe a theory, we sort of torture the data in order to fit the theory until it gets too distorted, and then there's a revolution. An entirely new theory comes along which fits the model, fits the reality in a better way. So he sort of, as I've put it in my book, he said most people think science works like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. He's absolutely rational. He's always making deductive, logical decisions. And of course, one of his catchphrases is, but that is illogical, Captain. Captain Kirk, when he solves problems, he does it in an entirely different way. He just plucks the answer out of thin air, doesn't really know why he's done it. He works intuitively, creatively. And Kuhn said, when you're really stuck in a crisis, Spock isn't going to get you out of the crisis. You need the Captain Kirk character to rethink the way we're working. So let's come back to advertising, because actually advertising and consumption goods and things like that are, I think, the clue to fixing the problem. So again, come back to economic theory. Economic theory, we're always trying to maximize our wealth. We're trying to get best value for what we buy. Okay, so why does anybody pay £1 million for a watch? Or £83 million for a pink diamond ring? Or $1.5 million, sorry, these are dollars, $1.5 million for a Tibetan Mastiff. Believe it or not, they're very fashionable in China at the moment, so people are paying £1.5 million for a dog. or £4,500 for a pizza with little flakes of gold on it, or $2,500 for a bottle of water. Bling. Bling is the key. There is an economist called Thorstein Veblen who came up with the phrase conspicuous consumption. He was the economist of Bling. He said a lot of what we buy is about positioning ourselves within society. It's about showing where we are in the social order. So I'm going to take a bit of Veblen's idea and a bit of Darwin, and I'm going to say society is a social pyramid. Let's think about Darwin and Adam Smith. Adam Smith said economic progress comes from competition. I'm going to just twist that slightly, well, not even really twist it much. I'm just going to say, fine, let's agree with Darwin. The competition is that everybody is trying to move up the social pyramid relative to their peers. They want to get ahead of their neighbours. And that was the point of the £50 experiment at the beginning. It makes some people happy when somebody progresses. It makes others less happy. Karl Marx says, yes, that's the problem. If you've got a society like this, you're going to configure it so that those at the top will rig the system so that the flows from the private sector cause wealth to flow up to the top of the social pyramid, and you end up with basically a feudal system, and that's why we've got to destroy it and have the revolution. Well, all I say in my book is actually, let's think about the institutional school. This guy's Oliver Cromwell. Britain had two revolutions. It first had Oliver Cromwell's revolution, then it had what's called the Glorious Revolution, and then a little while later there was the American Revolution, and then there was the French Revolution. And what did they do? They eventually established democracy, which started to control the people at the top, and they established progressive taxation, which now recycles the money back down the social pyramid, and that creates a circulatory flow. And incidentally, that circulatory flow is precisely how William Harvey fixed the anatomical problems of understanding the blood flow, when he recognized that there was another circuit of blood flow which took the blood out of the body and put it back towards the heart. So all I'm saying is, let's recognize that there is a state sector which pushes the money down the social pyramid and a private sector that pushes it back up. And that process keeps us on this hedonic treadmill, which is what's responsible for producing economic growth. So suddenly we've got a very simple model which allows us to accept that inequality is necessary to create the motivation, but also redistribution is necessary to keep the spending and consumption going. So this is a circulatory growth model, as I call it. And this fits Mr. Veblen's idea of why people do conspicuous consumption. It fits Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction of capital within the economy. It also fits the Austrians' idea, because you can understand the rich people at the top have got the money, the poor people at the bottom don't have the money, so they borrow money from the people at the top and then have to pay interest back to those at the top. That circuit goes in the opposite direction, so if you have too much debt in this system, the system stalls and you go into recession. It's not rocket science, but it's not mainstream economics either. So we can understand financial instability with this model. That's Fisher and Minsky. We can understand why Keynesian stimulus is sometimes needed. So we need to get rid of these old principles. We're not neoclassical optimizers. We don't all act individually. And the economy isn't driven to equilibrium. We are, in fact, all competitors. And when you're going around your daily business in the next few days, just watch the way people behave and ask yourself, are they competitors or are they optimizers? You'll be amazed at how much easier it becomes to understand behavior if you think in that way. We're not individuals. The economy is driven by circulation. So basically the motivation of growth is we think we're all about there. We really want to get up there. Darwin and Veblen understood this. Economics is all about relative social positioning. Thank you.